You're listening to a story from the archives. Every night before bed, I suggest you guys listen to these spooky stories. This is where our sponsor comes in. And now back to the story. The year is 1948. After decades of hardship under Stalin's regime, the Soviet Union has finally begun to see light at the end of the tunnel. It was a slow process, but the leader's grip on the country had started to loosen ever so slightly. However, this new hope would soon turn into tragedy when 5 men volunteered for a top-secret project that aimed to unlock the deepest secrets of the human brain. These 5 men were not your typical volunteers. All 5 had been convicted of political crimes and were serving their prison sentences in the infamous Vladimir Central Prison. Their names were erased from history. We don't know why they did it, but these 5 men volunteered for an experiment that promised to change history forever. Their experiment consisted of pushing the human body to its physical and mental limits by keeping the subjects awake for as long as possible. The men were told that their participation in the study would reduce their sentence. What they didn't realize was that they would never return from the experiment alive. They were led into a soundproof, airtight chamber with no windows. The chamber was then filled with an experimental gas that combined oxygen with an experimental chemical compound called AS2. The mixture was calculated to keep the subjects alert and conscious for up to a month. There was only one rule: they could not sleep. In addition to being deprived of sleep, the prisoners were denied food and water. However, during the course of the experiment, the scientists realized that this might be a little too cruel, even for the Soviet Union. So they provided the prisoners with all the food and water they needed. However, they refused to allow the prisoners to leave the chamber. This wasn't part of the original plan, but it was a necessary evil in order to ensure the prisoners' safety. The prisoners were given books and cards to help them play games. In the beginning, the prisoners were excited and happy. They spent their days playing games, eating, and talking to each other. After all, they were only going to be in there for 30 days. But as the days went by, the mood in the chamber began to change. By the 5th day, the prisoners' behavior had changed dramatically. They were still eating regularly, and they still had access to plenty of water. But the prisoners had stopped playing games. Instead, they spent most of their time whispering and arguing with each other. By the 10th day, the atmosphere in the chamber had become thick with paranoia. The prisoners were convinced that the other 2 were planning to escape while they were sleeping. As you can imagine, this made the prisoners even more vigilant. They wouldn't let themselves fall asleep because they were afraid of what the others might do while they were sleeping. By the end of the 10th day, the prisoners were starting to break down. They started screaming at each other, yelling threats and curses. Eventually, the screaming became unbearable. Scientists had to monitor the situation through cameras and microphones placed inside the chamber. They tried to calm the prisoners down over the intercom, but it didn't work. The scientists were getting worried. They had never seen anything like this before. On the 12th day, one of the prisoners, presumably driven to insanity, tore his own vocal cords. He must have thought that if he couldn't make noise, then the others wouldn't be able to either. But this only made the other prisoners angrier. As the weeks passed, the situation in the chamber grew more chaotic. On day 15, the scientists entered the chamber to check on the prisoners. They were shocked by what they saw. All 5 men had cut themselves. Some had cut off entire chunks of flesh. The wounds were deep and looked painful. But none of the prisoners seemed to be in any pain. They were all sitting quietly, staring at the floor. The scientists were shocked. They had never seen anything like this before. They immediately ended the experiment and rushed the prisoners to the hospital. 4 of the 5 prisoners died soon after. The 5th prisoner survived, but he was permanently brain damaged. However, before they ended the experiment, the scientists had recorded the entire thing. They had cameras set up inside the chamber, and they were able to watch everything that happened. But what really happened inside that chamber? Why did the prisoners behave so erratically? And why did they willingly harm themselves? We may never know the full story behind what happened in that chamber, but we do know that it was the result of sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation can have some pretty crazy effects on people. It can cause hallucinations, paranoia, and even psychosis. The scientists who ran the experiment believed that the prisoners were volunteering for a medical study. They had no idea that the prisoners would be subjected to such extreme measures. If they had known, they would have never allowed it to happen. But the prisoners were kept in the dark. They were told that they were going to be monitored, but they had no idea to what extent. They also had no idea how long they would be in the chamber. They were told that it would be between 3 and 5 days, but they didn't know that it would actually be much longer. This lack of information caused the prisoners to panic. They were already in a desperate situation, but as time went on, they became more and more desperate. They didn't know what was happening to them. They didn't know how long they'd been in the chamber, and they didn't know what would happen next. This is one of the reasons why the prisoners began to argue with each other. They were already stressed out and sleep deprived, and the last thing they needed was to be confined in a small space with people they didn't like. Another reason why the prisoners behaved so erratically was because of the gas that was pumped into the chamber. The gas contained oxygen, which is essential for human life. But it also contained a chemical compound that was designed to keep people awake. The problem is that we don't know exactly what this chemical compound did to the prisoners. We do know that it had some kind of effect on their brains, but we don't know what that effect was. It could have caused hallucinations, or it could have simply made the prisoners more susceptible to suggestion. Whatever the case, the gas played a role in the events that transpired in the chamber. But perhaps the most important factor in all of this was the fact that the prisoners were kept in the dark. They were denied basic information about the experiment, and this caused them to panic. If the prisoners had known what was going on, they might have been able to control their behavior. But as it was, they were helpless. Before we continue, make sure you guys subscribe. It really helps me out. Now back to the story. It's important to note that this story is based on a true event, but some details may have been exaggerated for dramatic effect. For example, the exact chemical composition of the gas used in the experiment is not known. Also, we don't know exactly what happened to the prisoners after they were taken to the hospital. However, we do know that the experiment took place and that it resulted in the deaths of 4 men. So what can we learn from this story? How can we make sure that something like this never happens again? Well, for starters, we need to be aware of the dangers of sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation can have some serious consequences. It can lead to hallucinations, paranoia, and even psychosis. We also need to be aware of the importance of giving people information. People need to know what's going on around them. They can't be kept in the dark because they'll panic. Finally, we need to make sure that experiments like this are never repeated. We need to respect the rights of all human beings and make sure that they're treated ethically. Now go leave a like on this video. And I'll see you guys later.